I used to think butterfly bush was a pollinator magnet, but now I'm not so sure. It's a question I've been trying to answer for myself this year by watching where pollinators are spending their time in my garden. When I first started gardening, butterfly bush was considered a must-have for a pollinator garden. So I planted them. But over time, butterfly bush has come under some scrutiny for a few reasons, primarily because it's a non-native species that has a tendency to escape our gardens and invade our wild spaces. Woodlea davidi in particular has even been banned from some US states. As I've been reading about butterfly bush, I've seen a few people have come to its defense, saying that, to quote from one article, butterfly bush is a favorite nectar source for adult butterflies. Just a handful of years ago, I would have agreed with that statement. But in my garden today, my butterfly bush looks comparatively like a ghost town. So what's going on? Where is everyone? Well, let's look around the garden here and see. And let's also talk about what's different between my last garden, where butterfly bush was a butterfly magnet, and my garden today, where it's really not. In my first garden at my previous home, butterfly bush was definitely the plant that attracted the most butterflies. I was a new gardener, and reflecting back, I had planted very few other nectar sources. So butterfly bush really was one of the only abundant nectar sources I had. In that garden, I would have definitely called it a butterfly magnet. But in hindsight, I didn't really have any other plants to compare it to. So that really doesn't answer my question, which is this: do butterflies actually prefer butterfly bush? One thing that really struck me in my first garden was that birds didn't visit me there. Like, at all. Not unless I hung a bird feeder. Later, when we moved into my current home and I found myself starting over with a blank slate, I did the same thing as before and planted 2 butterfly bushes, as well as some bluebeard and some lavender. But I also started working to try to figure out how to attract more birds, because I was lonely for them in my garden. I didn't just want them to enjoy my feeders, I wanted them to hang out in the whole garden. This was when I first learned about native versus non-native plants. Plants are usually marketed to us by zone, not by their native region. So the idea that specific plants came from specific regions had never even occurred to me. And the idea of specialized relationships between certain plants and certain insects or birds also was not something I'd ever heard about. Learning the ways in which bees, caterpillars, birds, and other wildlife really rely on the plants they co-evolved with, it was all news to me, and I wanted to see it for myself. So I got to work adding some native plants. This anise hyssop was one of the first native plants I installed. It's an abundant and long-blooming nectar source. In my garden today, I would definitely call this one of my pollinator magnets. This August, we've had a ton of these skipper butterflies. At one moment, I saw as many skippers on one flower stalk of anise hyssop as they were on the entire butterfly bush. Diversity of my tiny visitors is also much higher on the anise hyssop, but I'll come back to this topic. I've barely seen any monarchs this year, and I've been hearing the same from a lot of other people who are also missing the monarchs in their garden. But this little friend came over the other day to see what I had to eat and spent about an hour on my blue mist flower, and then at least 4 hours, I think closer to 5, on my anise hyssop. We had a downpour of rain for a few minutes, and the monarch hid out and then came back to the anise hyssop again. It ate until sunset and then even came back in the morning, although only for a few minutes. I haven't seen it since, but the only other time I've seen a monarch in my garden this year was this spring on my butterfly milkweed. So this was noteworthy and important to observe. Another pollinator magnet for me this year has been boneset, Eupatorium perfoliatum. This plant reminds me a bit of Joe Pyeweed, which actually also used to be in the same Eupatorium genus, but has since been moved to the Eutrochium genus. This boneset was actually a volunteer in my garden, and I had noticed a lot of pollinators were loving it. So I worked to propagate it in one of the earliest videos I ever posted, and I've since integrated it into a few areas of my garden. I've really come to adore this plant. It smells amazing, almost like cotton candy. I love the way its flowers kind of glow in the afternoon light, and it's covered in such a diversity of pollinators, which is something that's really stood out about my butterfly bush this year. Compared with the anise hyssop, boneset, and some other flowers, it's attracting much lower diversity of pollinators, mostly a few skippers and European honeybees. Although I did also get a visit from a clear-winged hummingbird moth. I haven't seen a single native bee on my butterfly bush. The anise hyssop and boneset are attracting a much higher diversity of bees, butterflies, and beneficial predators that can keep my little garden ecosystem in balance. This blue mist flower is another plant that I've really come to adore. It does well for me in mostly shade, and its bright green foliage really makes this dark little corner shine. It has a very long bloom period that goes into the fall, and it's an important nectar source, so this one is another great addition to support monarchs. When observing your garden, make sure to check it at different times of the day. This mist flower is sometimes without any pollinators, and at other times it's really humming. Time of day can be an important variable when looking for pollinator activity. For flowers that are primarily moth-pollinated, you might even need to sneak outside at night to see them at their most active. Also, if you've added new flowers to your garden, pollinators in your area might need some time to discover it, especially if you're in a neighborhood where there aren't that many flowers. All of that kind of timing stuff is important context when you're making observations of your garden. In addition to checking your blooms for activity, it's also important to check the leaves of your plants to see if butterfly and moth caterpillars are using them. We gotta be feeding the babies. One challenge for butterfly bush is that outside of its own native range, which is primarily China, it really can't support a butterfly's full life cycle. Plants don't want to be eaten, so they've developed different defenses. For example, chemical defenses in their leaves that make them hard to digest safely. When a plant is deer resistant, that's because it's worked hard at learning to taste yucky. But insects do need to eat. So certain insects have adapted to eat certain leaves, even the toughest leaves. Like monarch caterpillars or milkweed tussock moths, who have both adapted alongside milkweed, and unlike most other insects, these ones were able to adapt to eat the milkweed, even though it has sticky, toxic sap. Butterfly bush is of course an important pollinator habitat plant in its native range in China, but it didn't adapt alongside North American butterflies, and so it isn't meant for them, which means it serves as a host plant for 0 North American butterfly species. When I say people aren't seeing monarchs this year, sadly that's not a surprise. Among other problems, we simply don't have enough milkweed for monarchs to reproduce sufficiently, so their numbers will just keep going down until something really changes. That something is us. Our gardens can become monarch habitat if we start seriously adding native milkweed. Monarchs can find a patch of milkweed much easier than just a single plant, so planting in groups is a big help. And of course, more nectar sources, which are crucial for them, particularly near the spring and fall migration periods. Migration is a perilous thing to do, which is partly why monarchs have an uphill battle to recover their populations. So they could definitely use a hand from us. But they're not the only species in trouble. Here in Maryland, there are 42 species of Lepidoptera, which is butterflies and moths, currently listed as rare, threatened, or endangered, including 9 species that are believed to have gone locally extinct. Even more species are currently under consideration to be added to this list. So if we're passionate about pollinators, there's a lot of opportunity to learn about their needs and to add the plants that they need to our gardens. When deciding what to do about any particular plant, I find it helps to think about our goals for our gardens. A big goal for my own garden is to support an abundance and diversity of life. I want to be able to see lots of interesting birds and pollinators and wildlife. And I'm choosing my plants based on how they can support that goal. For example, choosing the plants in my garden to support the full life cycle of pollinators is really interesting and important to me. In order to do that, I've had to learn what birds and insects need from my garden, which has been such a massive learning experience. But I've discovered that learning is its own separate goal for me in the garden. Being able to observe and learn from nature has let me find a much more fulfilling sense of beauty than I ever could find before. Watching my bone set, for example, I noticed this giant grasshopper nearby making its way up the spent blooms from my sunflower. It looked like it was doing something important, so I just watched it. And I learned some grasshoppers like to eat seeds. Who knew? The world would be sadly quiet without the sounds of grasshoppers, so I'm excited to see that it found a snack in my garden. The best thing we can all do is go out into our gardens and observe. Getting outside to be a part of our little corner of the natural world is really good for us. I love seeing my plants, but even more so, I love seeing all the life flocking to my plants. The right solution will look different for each of us, but if you do have butterfly bush in your garden, you can help by pruning it back after it blooms to prevent seeds from dispersing away from your garden and into wild spaces. Personally, I'll be working to replace my butterfly bush in the coming years, but I'll wait to remove it until I have something yummy to put in its place. To find that something, I plan on researching more about endangered pollinator species in my area and the plants I can add specifically for them in my garden. In case they do show up, I want to do my best to greet them with snacks. I used to think that butterfly bush was a pollinator magnet, But now I think that was mainly because I hadn't yet learned what else to offer them. But I'm trainable. Watching where the pollinators are spending their time in my garden today, butterfly bush just doesn't look like their first choice. So I'm planning to follow their lead. If you want to start fostering more specialist pollinator relationships in your own garden, there are tons of amazing plants you can add. Watch this video to learn more about some very specialist plants. See what I did there? Specialist plants?